Have you ever walked in on a conversation that you could tell it was an important conversation and you kind of thought that you figured out what was going on, what was being talked about, and you walked away with one impression, but then later on you found out something about one of those people or something going on in their life, and suddenly the conversation took on a whole new meaning. And you realized that while what you thought was true, that there was so much more there that you hadn't picked up on because you kind of came in the middle of the conversation and you weren't aware of all the facts or all the information about those people's lives. When I was a youth pastor here at Swamp, we used to have this game that we would play where one person would leave the room and everybody else would have a conversation, and they would decide when that person came back, anytime they would do a certain thing. So if when the person came back, anytime that they would scratch themselves, or anytime that they would touch their ear or their face, or anytime they would say a certain word, that the whole room would do something. Maybe they would have their legs crossed one way, and when the person does something, then they would cross their legs the other way, or maybe they, are going to turn and look a certain direction. And you could go a lot of different ways with how the group is going to respond. So then the person comes back, and they don't know what their cue is for the group, and they don't know what the response is, and they have to try to figure out what's going on and figure out that conversation that happened without them being present. When we come to the passage this morning, that's a little bit of what is going on. We read this passage and we can easily think we have an understanding of it. It's talking about the day of the Lord. It's talking about the future end times, what we should expect when Jesus comes back, and how we're supposed to live now in light of that. And so there's this surface reading of the passage, but the reality is that there's a lot more that's going on than just on the surface. So we start with the surface, this idea of the day of the Lord, this theme of the idea that a day of judgment is coming when all nations will be judged by God, who is the King, who is the ruler of all people. This idea of the day of the Lord is picked up from the prophets who really developed this. Almost every one of the minor prophets talks about the day of the Lord and is looking with expectation towards this day when God will bring his justice. And so the question is, how are we as Christians supposed to live in light of that? How are we supposed to anticipate that? How does that relate to the way we engage in our daily lives? And what we find from Jesus, and Paul picks up, it almost seems like he's actually directly quoting some of the things that Jesus said here in this passage. He's doing some direct quotes, because Jesus is the one who tells his disciples that we don't actually know when this is going to take place, when the day of the Lord is going to happen, and we shouldn't try to figure it out. He says not even the Son himself, not even Jesus himself, knows exactly when these events are going to unfold. And so what we find Paul saying here in the beginning of the passage, he says, "Now, brothers and sisters, about times and dates we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." He goes on to say, like the way labor pains come on a pregnant woman, where you know that it's coming, but you don't know exactly when. And maybe there's some signs that things are heading in that direction, but sometimes you have false signs and it seems like it's time and then it's not, and you have to wait another week. And Paul says that's how the day of the Lord will come. Sometimes we're sure that the signs around us, the things that are happening, are showing that the end is near, and then sometimes the signs change and we realize that the labor pains didn't quite start yet. And so on the surface, it seems like this passage is saying that regardless of what is going on around us, regardless of whether it seems like Jesus is going to come back tomorrow or like it might be another 100 years, that we are supposed to live faithfully every day. That we're supposed to remain awake, we're supposed to remain alert, and we are supposed to live for Jesus no matter what is taking place around us. And that surface level reading the passage is all true, it's all accurate, but there's a lot more that's going on here. And in order to understand that, we have to step a little bit further into this conversation between Paul and the Thessalonians. We have to learn a little bit more about their context, about what was happening around them, and suddenly some of the phrases in this passage that to us don't mean much, we realize that to them it meant a lot. And it changes the meaning of the whole passage entirely. Thessalonica was a city on the edge of Macedonia. It was a port city with access to the sea, and so it was a major trade route between the area of Macedonia and lots of other places around. I'm not a historian, so I've done some research here, but there's so much more that could be said, and feel free to do some of your own research as well to learn a little bit more. But Macedonia was an ancient Greek empire. Maybe you're familiar with the name Alexander the Great, who really solidified a lot of the power and control of Macedonia there in that area of Greece. And so for centuries, they were a major powerhouse. They were an important nation to the extent that they had nations at the time. And so there was a lot of history here in Macedonia, a lot of identity and culture that had been developed. And there would have been many people, not just in Thessalonica, but in the surrounding region, who would have identified as Macedonians. And in fact, at one point, Thessalonica was actually the capital city of Macedonia. And so this identity of Macedonia, this history, all these narratives would have lived in the people of Thessalonica. This is who they were. This is who they had been for generations. They were Macedonians. But in the late BC and early AD, Rome overtook Macedonia. At first it became, it was kind of this slow conquest where there was multiple waves of it, and at first it became a province of the Roman Empire, and eventually Thessalonica actually became a Roman city where the citizens actually had Roman citizenship. They didn't have to pay taxes. They had special rights because of their newfound allegiance to Rome. But as Rome did with certain regions that they took over, Macedonia was still allowed to maintain a lot of their separate identity, a lot of their separate culture. And so even though they were part of the Roman Empire, even though they were a Roman province and certain areas had even a greater allegiance to Rome, even though some of them were Roman citizens, many of them still would have identified as Macedonians. And so Thessalonica is in the middle of this divided political environment where you have some people who long for the day when a new Macedonian king like Alexander the Great will come and actually throw off the Roman Empire and reset them up as their own people and live out some of their culture and who they wanted to be as a people. So you have some people on that side of the political spectrum. You have other people who are happy for Rome, who believe that Rome has actually brought good things, has actually increased their trade, has actually made Thessalonica an even better city than it was in the past. And so you have some who would have identified even more as Romans rather than as Macedonians and wanted to continue the allegiance to Rome because of some of the benefits that it brought. And so it's in this context that Paul came to Thessalonica, a Roman Macedonian city with a lot of these political undertones and undercurrents going on, and at times revolts happening in different parts of Macedonia, and this question always of, will Thessalonica remain loyal to Rome or not? It's in this context that Paul came preaching about a king. And the message of the gospel had real political ramifications in the city of Thessalonica. And again, there's things that we don't pick up on, like the fact that Caesar was referred to as the son of the gods. And here is Paul preaching Jesus, saying he is the Son of God. That Rome was supposed to be this unifying kingdom of all people, all tribes, all nations, all being able to gather under Rome and find peace and security there. And here comes Paul preaching a kingdom that unites all tribes, all nations, and all tongues underneath a king, Jesus. And even the idea of Rome was this idea of Pax Romana, or the peace of Rome, that when Rome came, even though they came with violence, ultimately their goal was to bring peace to all people as they united all people together under one kingdom. And here comes Paul preaching the peace of Christ. And so we find in Acts 17 verses 6 and 7 that when Paul came to the city of Thessalonica, the result was this riot that happened. And this is what they say. They say, these men, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, who have caused trouble all over the world, have now come here to Thessalonica. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. And so knowing these things, knowing the tensions in the city at the time, knowing how the message of the gospel actually had real political ramifications, now we start to pick up on things in this passage that the Thessalonians would have been very aware of hearing it read for them, but we might miss on a surface reading. When Paul says in verse 3 that while people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. We think that he's just talking about random people, about people in general who aren't expecting the day of the Lord. But the reality is that that phrase, peace and safety, peace and security, was a catchphrase of the Roman Empire. It would have been as familiar to them as the phrase liberty and justice for all would be to us. This was a way of symbolizing the Roman Empire all in one phrase. Essentially, Paul says, while Rome is saying peace and safety, destruction is going to come on them. Jacob Elias, commenting on this passage, says, essentially, Paul and his co-workers warn the Thessalonians that the Roman peace, as gained and maintained through military conquest and rule, is a false and empty security. Ironically, while pursuing their own peace and security through oppressing those who confess Jesus Christ as Lord, they will face sudden destruction. And so here at the beginning of this passage, Paul starts by alerting them that he's addressing the political reality that they are living in. And then he gives some specific instructions about how they are supposed to live. And at the end, we find him again using a military metaphor about how they as Christians are supposed to, what their breastplate is, what their helmet is, what they believe brings peace and security. And so this whole passage has these political overtones or political undertones to it that we may not pick up on our own. But once we understand the context, we realize that this whole passage for the Thessalonians was directly addressing how they were supposed to live as people in a political environment. And so we are going to look at how does this passage, what does it tell us about how we live in the midst of the political environment that we find ourselves in today. If you rank military spending per country, the United States spent more on our military in 2019 than the next 10 countries in the world combined. But oftentimes to question something like that, to question what that means about what America is or what America stands for, will bring accusations against you like that you aren't actually thankful for the relative privilege that we experience in this country, or that you are a socialist or an anarchist. But the reality is that questioning the narratives of the nations and governments that we find ourselves in is a very Christian and very biblical thing to do. It's a pattern that we find all throughout Scripture. Now, that is as political as I'm going to get in this sermon, so don't click away just yet. It's important that we see that this passage is political. It's directly addressing the political environment of their day. But we also have to understand and have to know that we do not live in the same political reality today that they did in Thessalonica. America is not Rome. You can't draw a one-to-one correlation between the two. And so I'm not going to suggest that this passage tells us exactly how we should understand current political environments or who we align ourselves with or any of that. That's not where we're going. The question is, how does this passage help us to understand how we as Christians engage in our current political environment? And the first thing that we find as we come to this passage is that Paul warns them and warns us that we must watch our soul. We must watch our soul. Politics can consume you. Politics can overcome you. Politics can so change the way that you see the world that it makes it impossible for you to receive the message of Christ. Politics can numb you to the real needs of others and those around us. It can make the world such just a mental exercise of thinking that if we can just figure out the right details of who's in charge or what government looks like or the best forms of government, that all the needs of the world will be taken care of, and it can actually numb us to the real needs of our neighbor. It can make us unwilling to listen to those who are crying out for salvation, for freedom, for hope. We end up hearing any cry from our neighbor for help as a political statement rather than actually hearing their heart and what it is that they need. And that goes every direction in our current divided political environment. When everything becomes about politics for us, when politics consume us, it makes us numb to the real needs of others. And so Paul says we need to watch our soul. We need to watch ourselves. We need to pay attention to what's happening inside of us. And I realize for some of you, you maybe think, why in the world are we talking about politics today? And some of it's just the next section of 1 Thessalonians that we're going through. We talked about sex and work 2 weeks ago. We talked about death last week, and now we get to talk about politics. So we're just hitting out all the big ones one after another. But the reality is, I know that for many of you, you maybe are exhausted. You're sick of hearing about politics. We just spent an entire election season, and it looks like it's not going to be done anytime soon as it continues to go on. And so in the midst of that, there's a warning. What impact is that political environment around us having on you? What's happening inside of you? How do you find yourself responding? Do you see the fruit of the Spirit growing within you? Or is the Spirit being sucked out of you? Do you like who you are becoming? Are you becoming more like Jesus? In the midst of a politically charged time, we must watch our soul. We must be careful that we're staying focused on what is important. Paul uses this metaphor here of the light and the day. It's almost as if as if he says that there was a time of darkness, there was a time of night, and that Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection, that the light started to break through, that dawn started to come. And if you've ever been outside at a time when it's nighttime and then slowly things start to turn from black to gray, you start to be able to see a little bit more. And the day is still far away, but you see and you know that it's starting to come, and dawn can happen slowly until suddenly the sun pops up from behind the horizon. And it's as if Paul says that's the time we live in right now. We live in the time of the dawn, where the old order of things is still here. We still live in the night. But the new order is coming. Day is dawning. Light is coming from behind the horizon. We don't know when the sun is going to pop up. We don't know when the day of the Lord is going to come and Jesus is going to set all things right. But we have a choice now whether we live as if it's still night or whether we live as if it's the day. And so he uses two different metaphors connected with that. Two things that happen at night. People sleep at night. People get drunk at night, he says. And then he calls us to act as if it's already day. And this can be confusing, and some people, I've heard this passage used before as a passage speaking against drunkenness, and there are passages in the Bible that speak about drunkenness, but this is not one of them. Because Paul says, you are all children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet. And so since in the same sentence, Paul talks about people sleeping at night and people getting drunk at night, if we believe Paul's talking about literal drunkenness, we have to believe he's also telling us as Christians we are never allowed to sleep. And we know that's not the case, and so Paul is using this as a metaphor. So when we think about these two activities that we use to cope with darkness, that people use to cope with night, sleep, and alcohol, we realize that one of these is an internal state. Sleep is something that we choose for ourselves. It's something that overcomes us because we are tired and we're not able to stay awake anymore, and so we sleep as it gets dark. So we watch ourselves, we watch our soul. But drunkenness is something outside. It's something external to us that if we allow it to enter us, it changes us. It makes us different. And so Paul says, in the midst of this political environment that you find yourselves in, watch your own soul, watch what's coming from within you. Don't allow yourself to become numb, to fall asleep, but also watch what's outside of you and what you're allowing to enter into you. Don't fall asleep in the night, and don't become drunk. Political narratives can change how we view the world. Politics can distract and consume us. And so as important as it is for us to watch our own soul and to check where we are at personally, it's also important for us to watch what we watch, to watch what we consume, to pay attention to who we are allowing to speak into our lives and to speak into how we view the world. What narratives are you allowing to take hold in your life? How do you test or decide what is true or what is false? Who do you belong to? Where do you place your identity? Paul says here, we do not belong to the night or to the darkness. There's this question of belonging. Where do we place our sense of belonging, and who do we align ourselves with? And so for us, in the midst of the time we live, I really believe that an important message of this passage is to unplug, to set healthy boundaries for yourself. Take times where you turn off the TV, where you leave your phone in another room. Make sure that you start your day not by checking your news feed or checking the news, but instead reading scripture and grounding yourself in what you know is important. In the midst of a political environment that can consume us, that can distract us, that can become overwhelming, we must watch our soul, watch what's happening inside of us. But we must also watch what we watch. Pay attention to what we're consuming, so we don't allow ourselves to become drunk by the political narratives or the political stories or the political characters around us that we are allowing ourselves to consume and become part of us. The third thing that we see that this passage says about how we engage in the political environment around us is that we must watch our actions. We must watch our actions. Paul, after he talks about this night and the day, this idea of living in the dawn and that we're supposed to be anticipating what's to come rather than looking at what has been behind, he says, "But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet." Being part of the day leads us to action. It leads us to battle. He uses a military metaphor of saying, in the midst of this political environment, as we watch our own soul, as we watch what we consume and what's around us, we must protect ourselves. We must put on armor. And the armor is faith and love, which we've seen through the rest of 1 Thessalonians is always related to action. Faith isn't just about what we believe, it's how we act in light of what we believe. Love isn't just something that we feel, it's about how we act and treat others. And so we must watch our actions. We cannot sit idly by in this world. There's a temptation when we look within our own soul and when we look at the world around us and what we consume to just withdraw, to think that we're better off not being aware of politics or the political environment. We just ignore it and turn it off. But Paul says we cannot sit idly by. How do you respond to injustice? When you see someone at work who's not being fairly compensated, or a friend who's being taken advantage of by a spouse or a romantic partner, or children that you see that are being neglected. How do you respond when you see injustice? We can't allow the political environment around us to cause us to just withdraw, and when we see real injustice in our lives to say, well, I can't speak about that because how are people going to understand it or interpret it, or what's it going to come across as? We must be willing in the midst of divided political time to still address injustice and speak up on behalf of the innocent who are being harmed. Healthy political engagement as Christians is always driven by local action on behalf of the vulnerable. Healthy political engagement is always driven by local action on behalf of the vulnerable, the homeless, those who have been forgotten, those that no one else is paying attention for. We must look for injustice in our world, and we must act. The Bible is a very political book. From the beginning in Genesis that ends with Abraham's family going into Egypt, all the way to the end, Revelation. And so many people try to guess, how do modern politics fit into the categories of prophecy that takes place or things that are said? But Paul answers this concern that by teaching that living in faith, love, and hope is the proper way to be prepared so that the day of the Lord will not surprise us like a thief. The answer, no matter when we are living or where we are living or what's going on around us, is for us to act out of the reality of faith in Christ, love for God and love for our neighbor, and the hope that God is bringing the salvation that we all long for. So in the midst of the political environment we find ourselves in, we watch our own soul. We watch and pay attention to the things that we are consuming, that we're allowing to influence us. We watch our actions, how we're acting. And fourth and last, we watch our community. Paul ends by saying, therefore, in light of all of this that he's talking to them about, therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. The purpose of the church is to be a place not where we all agree with each other, but where we all can support and encourage one another as we each seek in our own lives to live out faith, hope, and love. Where do you go for support? Who do you believe is doing the most good in the world? As Christians, we must be engaged in and plugged into the church. We must be building relationships with other believers because of our common faith in Jesus. Even when we find ourselves disagreeing, even when we have questions, we can't pull away from those disagreements. We actually have to press in to encourage each other to remain faithful to Christ in the midst of the times that we live in, to participate with each other in the work of addressing injustice, even when we struggle and we disagree with what that looks like or the best way to accomplish that. We must work in and through the community of faith. So when we look at the current political environment that we live in, and as I said, many are tired, many are ready to just forget about politics. This passage encourages us to look within ourselves, to not allow ourselves to fall into complacency or to fall asleep, to look outside ourselves. What are we consuming? What are we allowing to influence us and shape the way that we think and believe and live? To look at our actions, to watch our actions and consider what they say about our heart and what they say about whether we're living in line with Jesus, in the way of Jesus. And last, to pay attention to and watch our community, where it is we find our identity and where it is that we belong. May you this week not withdraw. May you not believe that the best thing is for you just to pay attention to yourself and what you need and ignore the needs of those around us. But may you also not be sucked into the political narratives and the political tension of our time. Instead, may we follow Jesus faithfully, looking to Christ our King to direct and lead and guide us as we work to bring His kingdom of righteousness, peace, and joy into our world.